Welcome to Talking Digital Academy, the audio format for the Digital Academy conference organized by Bielefeld University. The Digital Academy is an annual online workshop dedicated to current questions in digital humanities research. This year's theme is Building Workflows in the Digital Humanities. The workshop focuses on how digital research processes are planned, carried out and reflected upon, from the handling of data to the question of how research can remain transparent and reusable over time. Over the course of the workshop, participants explored what it means to build reliable workflows for scholarly practice. They discussed not only technical solutions, but also the methodological choices behind them. How data is prepared, how tools shape research, and how digital projects can be made sustainable beyond their immediate context. For a deeper dive into these questions, the final day of the workshop was organized as an open space day. There, experts from the field shared their perspectives on digital workflows and reflected on their own research practice. These expert interviews form the basis for the 3 podcast episodes on this channel. Our host for this podcast is Silke Schwand, Professor of Digital History at Bielefeld University. Our third and final guest at today's Open Space Day is Quinn Dombrowski from Stanford University.
Quinn, so glad to have you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being with us. Albeit the time difference is sometimes difficult, but you were very convincing that 9 a.m. is okay-ish to do this. So welcome to our Digital Academy Open Space Day. The Digital Academy is running its 5th installation this year, and we always find different topics to have like summer school comparable events. And we always finish with an open space day where we invite different experts on the topic of the year. And this year's topic was building workflows in digital humanities. And we're really, really happy to have you with us so that we can talk shop a little bit and see, what your experiences are with workflows. I'm just going to introduce you very, very quickly and then hand over to you to sort of give us an self-introductory remarks to let us know what is most interesting about workflows for you. So as we've discussed already, Quinn Dombrowski is currently working at Stanford University, although not living there, which seems to be a good compromise. You work in so many fields, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But I think I'm just going to pick up some important points which also made us think of you and invite you to our event is your engagement in all things digital humanities, but also especially the Data Sitters Club, which I always really liked when thinking about, data sets and data feminism as well. Also, the different perspectives that you brought forward with engaging in cultural heritage, thinking about the Sutro project, and that was really big for when Twitter was still Twitter. Don't really know where everybody went, but anyway. So we're really, really happy to have you and have this cross-Atlantic, I think so, conversation today. So let's start our conversation. And the kickoff question, as it was with the other expert as well, was if you'd like to kind of do like a self-introductory, have a self-introduction about you, about yourself, about your work, about, your take on workflows to kick us off.
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Workflows are something kind of near and dear to my heart and really go back to kind of the very first big project I was involved in with digital humanities, which was Project Bamboo, a disaster of a cyber infrastructure initiative, around 2009. Basically, what would happen if a bunch of IT people decided they knew what digital humanists needed, like in a moment where like kind of community and connection and examples were the things that the humanists actually needed. But they're like, well, what about a Java-based services platform? And so I spent several years working on the IT side, but as the person with the most background in doing this digital humanities work, but then also the most junior person. So kind of weirdly situated between worlds. going down these pretty ill-advised rabbit holes that ultimately came to nothing other than the article I wrote on whatever happened to Project Bamboo, which sort of spelled out some of those issues. I mean, I think workflows are interesting because, like with sort of many things kind of at this intersection of IT and humanities, like there are things that sort of like sound like kind of clear and official and easy to document and objective and repeatable. But in the reality, like when you get right down to it, these workflows, however well we document them and write them down, like they're being done by humans who are like incredibly, unpredictable and subject to all kinds of forces outside of kind of the nice box of the workflow. Humans with their own lives and issues and challenges that arise and feelings. And I think all of those are very real parts of the workflow and the work that we do. And that's something that we try to capture with the Data Sitters Club, where sometimes we have an interlude of like, and then I was really upset like with this data set because just nothing was working and I was so frustrated and like, I called a friend and cried. And yeah, I mean like that's the reality of doing this work. And I think one of the things that we're trying to normalize is exactly that human element that like, even if you're following the steps precisely, like, having like a personal crisis or just like a breakdown or getting just like super angry like with your materials and like having feelings along the way is actually perfectly normal and is like this happens to all of us. So yeah, that's sort of what immediately comes to mind. I mean, strangely these days, in addition to, supporting non-English literature, computational text analysis work in the department that I work in, trying to find applications for AI that aren't awful, like, got a lucky handwritten text recognition. I was a terrible paleography student, and like, the stuff makes my heart sing, because I certainly cannot transcribe that page. I'm happy that we have tools now that can with some degree of accuracy. And doing Data Sitters Club stuff. I run a project management, Dungeons and Dragons style role-playing game class that I'm have to completely redo for this upcoming winter because the final project was all about, writing a DH grant for the National Endowment for the Humanities, which functionally no longer exists. So that's exciting. Yeah, and I've been doing a lot of textile stuff these days, and I think there's actually a lot of parallels between various textile craft work, especially when you intersect it with data, and the things that we do with digital humanities. So that's me, I guess.
Thank you. Thank you so much for letting us know and giving us some of the, like a very lively impression of how frustrating, but also engaging. And I don't know, you have to love what you do, right? To sort of stick with it, in spite of all the difficulties in standardization or non-standardization or
Or you
whatever.
haven't hate it enough. You can also be fueled by spite. And there are definitely
Okay.
projects that like I have gotten done like because I was not going to let them beat me. So you can go two routes, and sometimes it's both. And yeah.
Yeah. So part of the organizational team for this digital academy are the members of the so-called Flow project, where we also work on establishing workflows for humanist or humanities research projects. And I was really happy to hear that you do like the application of language models and AI for the transcription of documents, because that's basically what we're doing for underrepresented historical languages. So historical German, medieval Latin, and so on and so forth. And our experience is that, or what we wanted to aim at is to provide different modules rather than sort of designing a full-blown workflow. So what is your take on, is there such a thing as like a complete workflow that you can just follow? Or would you say, what are your experiences with sort of workflows that were given to you or that you used, or maybe also designed and implemented on your side?
Yeah, I mean that's the dream, isn't it? Like
Mm.
the idea that like there's something where you can like start to finish, like hand off a thing and be like, just follow these steps and you will be doing digital humanities. Like people want to give that to people who are starting. People who are starting want the
Yes.
reassurance that like there is a clear path that you can follow and there's a map and there's some steps and there's some checkpoints and like you will just go and do that. I think I think those of us who have been in the trenches of doing this, realize that like that is a fantasy.
Never
And
works.
it is well intentioned and like you feel for the people who are trying to make this work or who are seeking like those kinds of answers, but like we know full well those answers don't exist. And like even if you have the map, I mean, in a certain sense, like, being promised a complete workflow is a disservice because
Mhm.
what the person may then end up doing is like trying to follow this well past the point where it makes sense. Like it's easy to sort of like take a map, a guide, a narrative, and kind of cling to it, like a life raft, especially when things aren't going well with your project, when like the answer is to like take a step back, take a deep breath, go for a walk, talk to your collaborators, and think about like what does this project actually need right now? And like what do we need as people who have to like wake up every morning and confront this project? And the answer might not be like, follow the map harder. Like sometimes you need to take a different route. Or maybe like the performance of the model that you're using is just like not getting better and it's probably not going to, and you just need to manually annotate some things. And like that's okay. Like that's not any less right or good or like doing digital humanities the way you should. Like all of these projects are messy and complicated, and there's no way to to have that perfect complete workflow that you
Mhm.
can hand off. I mean, that said, I mean, I think the modules idea is really great because there's also the extreme where you just like throw up your hands and you're like, well, every single project is a unique special snowflake, and the answer to that is also no. Like you don't need to reinvent. Like, I mean,
Mhm.
back when we were doing Project Bamboo, like the thing that everyone was like writing from scratch code-wise was like a fancy looking page flipper thing for like, documents on the internet. Like everyone had their Baroque custom special snowflake JavaScript for like flipping pages. And like we don't need that. Like that's
True.
not the heart of the project. That's not the part that needs to be like highly customized and like responsive to the exact data. It's a page flipper. Just pick one and like make it work with your thing. Um, so yeah, having modules that like take parts of it, especially parts of it that are, complicated or weird or like kind of fiddly or like things that, would take a lot of time to get set up from scratch, like by all means, yes, like make that available and usable for other people to like pick up and adapt. I was recently writing a piece about the Data Sitters Club for a collection of little blurbs by tool makers. And sort of the ironic thing about the Data Sitters Club in this context is that we don't build things, like we don't build
Mhm.
new tools. All the code that we have, more or less, is like reused from something or cribbed from something. Like I am not a strong coder, and I I take no particular joy in like building something from scratch in that context. Like please give me something that works and like let me adapt it. And I think it's those sorts of things that can be reused and picked up and like minimally modified and sort of like put into workflows. But the second you're trying to design like a start to finish thing, like you're gonna come crashing into the harsh reality of messiness without much delay.
Yeah, I totally agree. I like to tweak code rather than write it really from scratch. And also I'm not a trained coder anyway. So we kind of pick up bits and pieces of knowledge along the way, and then you kind of learn
And
how
they
to
should
read
be.
that.
Like this is something that I run into a lot is um you know humanities grad students will come to me and they're like, I want to learn to code, and I'm like, okay, well, what does that mean for you? Because what
Hmm.
I quickly find to be true, and certainly what's true for myself, is that like I don't actually want to learn to code. Like to this day, I have still never made it through an entire intro to Python book. Like what, like I don't want to be a coder like as my primary thing, like and understand like these different coding languages the way I understand human languages because of going through like, training as a medieval Slavist. Like what I want to do is I want to do things that I am interested in,
Hmm.
my text, with my data. Um, and granted, like there's a level of ignorance beyond which, like, it's kind of dangerous to just like throw tools at people and say, like, have at
Yeah.
it with a chainsaw. But like at the same time, like, you don't need to learn to code the way that a lot of the sort of pedagogical materials are trying to teach you to understand code and learn to code. Like you can learn to do things with code. And that's a route that is often more productive than getting stuck up on like learning to code. And of course, like, vibe coding and AI is sort of changing this equation in interesting ways too. But still, like getting to a point where you can comfortably work with code, read code, modify code, is often just a better target for people than getting stuck on this like learning to code idea.
And I think it's really reassuring to sort of put this, what you just said, also out there to grad students or even to humanities researchers who are not so familiar with the digital world is the wrong, using data and
Yeah.
tools that can sort of compute and do quantitative stuff with and so on. To actually, don't tell them do a Python course first, but before
Oh,
that
they
you
won't.
cannot be part of the conversation because then exactly then they won't even start. So I
Well,
was
it
thinking,
sucks. Like, how many
sorry,
times, like, it really sucks to, like, do those courses. It's like, like, what I want to do is, like, count frequent, like, I want to count word frequencies.
yeah.
And here I am, like, going through these exercises to print hello world. Like, how do I get from there to here? Like, you can actually get much closer by starting over here with, like, let's start by doing the
Yeah,
thing.
exactly. Yeah, so but this what kind of leads me to the next point then. So how do we, with maybe modular workflows, how do we make it easier for people to start engaging with this kind of thing? I mean, even if I think back to my students, so I do medieval history slash digital history at Bielefeld University. And I always have sort of medieval examples, but we do lots of sort of quantitative text analysis, word frequency, and so on. Um, and I sometimes think that, throwing tools at them, as you said, is like a valid first step sometimes to just open like a panorama of possibilities, isn't it? And then sort of lead them along the way of sort of finding their own particular interest, like the methodology that kind of makes most sense to them. How do you deal with that? Do you have
Yeah.
situations like these where you kind of, well,
Oh, definitely. I mean,
obviously, all of us do, but what are your examples, maybe?
this is an interesting one. It kind of since I came up through the like university IT route, rather than the like
Hmm.
sort of scholar, faculty, all of that stuff. I remember there being a lot of tension back in the bamboo days, between this question of like, should the technologists like just be responsive to the questions that the scholars come up
Hmm.
with? Or do technologists have something to offer in like giving people tools that they can try out, and will this then spur kind of more interesting questions that they may not have thought of themselves? And like, is that an equally valid path? And I'm fairly philosophically committed to that being an equally valid path. Honestly, I think, jumping right into workflow, like especially as a terminology, is often
Hmm.
doing people a disservice, because like people start getting kind of nervous and insecure about it, where it's like, if it's a workflow, then like surely I must understand these things better than I actually do in order to put it together. Workflow suggests an endpoint, and they may not even know really what the endpoint is. And so there's a lot of like, anxiety and imposter syndrome that can get tipped off when you start talking about, okay, like go create a workflow and do a thing. And I think an alternate approach that often is more generative and kind of leaves everyone feeling a little bit better and a little bit clearer about kind of what the endpoint might be, is thinking about it as play. Like,
Hmm.
what are some things, what are some toys that you have that you can play with your data? I like Voyant remains one of my absolute
Yes.
favorite things this
Me
way.
too. Yeah.
It's like it's joyful. Like it's a joyful environment conducive to play and surfacing interesting things that you wouldn't have seen if you were just like looking at this text file. It's really beautiful that way. And sort of once you play with your data a bit, it's a way to like test some of your like, hunches about things like, oh, I think that the term water occurs more in the first half of this book. Oh, well, turns out it doesn't. Actually, it's just kind of randomly distributed. Okay, next idea. Without having like, really invested in like I have first formulated a research question about water and then I will go investigate it. And oh no, my investigation has failed. Like just a low stakes way to like start getting a feel for like what your data looks like with this methodology, coming up with some ideas, and then once you kind of can coalesce those ideas into something that looks more like a research question, like getting your feet wet with the tools, then you can go make a workflow and feel like you're going to get somewhere. But yeah, I mean, I think play is just vitally important for this, especially for for people new to this, and also, I mean, for people who've been doing this for a while, putting together a data set is usually a slog. Like, it sucks. Like,
Yes.
there's just so much time and so much effort and so much fiddly stuff, that, I mean, I feel like, having some time to, like, play with this, like, thing you've created through all these hours of tedium is like, a reward in a way to, like, kind of feel like that labor is redeemed and worth it, kind of regardless of like where your ultimate study ends up going.
And it does get you excited. I always think that, this sort of playful, explorative entry point is so important. I still use Voyant tools like that. Like it's my first step when I start a new project and see what happens with whatever I put in to sort of do exactly what you described. And I think this makes a lot of sense. But then, if you think about people who have to sort of finish their PhDs or they have sort of projects that are more or less they have a limited amount of time. They do have to finish a certain amount of work, like for a qualification. And I think that, this playful phase is valid, very much so, but then you kind of have to start organizing. And
Yeah.
what are your takes on, how do I get from, oh, this looks cool, I want to do this, to I don't know. My PhD was on conceptual history of virtues and early medieval mirrors of princes. So how do I get from wow, this is cool to that? And what is the in between? So what do you want to say? What do you say?
I mean, like that for me is always the hardest step.
Hmm.
Because the playing phase, like you end up with like 100 different ideas of like I could look at this and I could look at this and like I could look at this. This is interesting and this is interesting too. And like having to narrow it down to like from 100 things to like maybe 5 things. Like it's hard. And again, I mean, it feels like, like putting down like all sorts of like glorious, fascinating, glittering, jewels and just like, committing to a handful that like, may not even be your favorite ones. And I mean, I think one of the ways that I've dealt with this myself is, like keep your little notes file, like with all the other interesting things that you could do. Like and putting them down doesn't necessarily mean that like you have to say goodbye to them forever. Like maybe you could get a conference talk like out of one of those other things. And like maybe that would be a way to like kind of help keep you engaged like with the project overall. To be able to like have some fun things on the side that like when you're really frustrated with your main analysis, you could go like explore some of those a little bit more. And some of them will turn into things down the road. It's not a matter, even when you're on a deadline, it's not a matter of like absolutely like, cutting off access to like all the other fun things. It's just sort of like these are the ones that I'm going to take a look at right now. And those ones are still there and like they haven't disappeared just because I can't spend all my time on them. So yeah, I mean, I think the next step that, you have to do is sort of like turn some of those things into like a research question that is legible for your discipline. And what that's going to look like is going to vary, field by field, even like advisor by advisor. In some contexts, like, people are working with advisors or in programs that are just really not into the digital thing. And so like, doing something about like, training a model or doing, like a principal component analysis visualization, like that stuff is not going to fly as your end product. So I think part of it is getting a sense of like, what is the landscape that you're in? What are the professional expectations in the field that you're in order to like, be successful meeting those benchmarks? And then, you'll have a sense of what the end product needs to look like. But how you get there can kind of be a private affair of your own. So this is something that I talk to grad students about sometimes when they're working with an advisor who is really not into the digital thing. I talk about stealth DH. Like, certainly there are people like me who will like, happily like wear the digital humanist like t-shirt and like, yes, it's like how I identify professionally. But you don't have to. And you also don't have to talk about this stuff. Like, all of these digital methods and tools can be things that you do in the privacy of your own laptop, and like, your advisor doesn't necessarily need to know. So even things like, word frequencies and looking at like distribution of terms over a text, you're not cheating. There's no shame in doing that, even if like what you're writing is like a very traditional like close reading analysis. Like, you have these tools that can, basically save you, tens or hundreds of hours of like going through with a highlighter and sticky note. Use them. Like, there's nothing wrong with doing that. And you can produce something that like, reads very analog and traditional at the end, if like that's the path that you're on and the expectations that you have. So yeah, I mean, there's just sort of this process of balancing like what you're expected to produce, the kinds of questions that you're encouraged to ask, and then thinking about like, are there tools or methods or things that would let me do this work better? And honestly, this is kind of, I guess, the driving question that's kind of been haunting me my entire career. I mean, part of the reason why I quit a PhD in Slavic linguistics was there was no like one question that like I was willing to spend 5 years of my life on. Like, I wanted to help people think about like, how do we do this research better? And like, yeah, you don't have to be afraid or be ashamed of using digital methods, even if you're in a very analog context. It's just a matter of what you produce out of that at the end.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. I think this is a really important point as well, because even as a digital history chair, like the grad students that work with me, or I with them rather, anyway, they always kind of have this opposition in their minds. Do I have to decide now whether I identify as a historian, more or less traditional, or do I want to identify with as a digital humanist? Is there an in between? So I think what you just said really kind of, opens up a whole new way of thinking about this. Even though I'm obviously also identifying as a digital humanist, but, sometimes I tell them, if you don't want to go down that road, be as traditional as you want to be. And I'm fine with that. You don't, because there's a sort of, that's the flip side to the story. You have the example of the traditional advisor, and then do stealth DH, and I'm the DH advisor where everybody can still do like a very traditional medieval, work, and maybe slip in some exciting stuff as well.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. Well, since the summer school is on workflows, though, we were thinking and talking with the other experts also about, first of all, defining the term. So if you speak about workflows, what do you associate? You started with this already when you said, workflow kind of always implies that there's an end to something because it goes somewhere. We were sharing thoughts about, designing modular workflows. But are there other aspects to it? For example, like one thing that we discussed was that talking about workflows, making these steps in the process explicit, even if you don't call it a workflow, but talk about your methodology, talk about your decisions. Do you think that this is like a plus side of working in that particular way? Like, for example, humanistic interpretations, or people don't always tell us where they got the idea from in a way that we would do if we needed to formalize it in order to make it computational. So what is your take on sort of that kind of relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly a kind of cultural thing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
exactly because, in traditional humanistic research, like there's no way that you can even come close to doing the sort of documentation that we do on the digital side. I mean, you read a bunch of things and then the ideas sort of like bounce around in your head for a while and then like you have an insight on something, but like there's no way for you to trace that back. I mean, other than
Mm-hmm.
like, in a certain sense, like the bibliography is kind of the best equivalent, sort of. But it's just it's a really different thing. Um, I mean, I one of the things that I like about sort of the workflow based thing is this kind of ability to share how you came about.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, it's pedagogical as much as anything. Making the path a little bit easier for the next person. Going back to a real vintage DH effort here. I've always really loved Miriam Posner's How Did They Make That
Mm-hmm.
blog posts. Just like
Yeah.
breaking down these things that like look really fun and fancy and exciting, um, and kind of like bridging the gap for people who are like, well, that seems amazing, but I could never possibly do that. And just sort of like taking it down into the steps that you would do to do that. And we try to do that in the Data Setters Club as well. Going from like, these fancy end visualizations to like, how did we actually get there?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of I think part of the process is demystifying kind of how many subjective choices go into it.
Mm-hmm.
So many times along the way, even if you're doing an objective workflow, like you just have to make the call that like we're gonna be looking at 20 books. Like, why 20 books? Well, it's a number of
Because
five and smaller than 100, and we didn't have time for 100, so we'll do 20. And like literally like that's it. And like that's also fine. But it weirds people out when they're thinking about workflows and sort of the sense of like objectivity and like endpoints. Like there must be a right answer for each of these steps, and there really isn't. Um,
mm-hmm.
so yeah, I mean, kind of like, teaching people, where you made those calls when sometimes it's just kind of arbitrary and like and that can still be okay to produce like reasonable research. Yeah. So yeah, I mean it's
Yeah,
it's it's a story. Like it's a story, it's a pedagogical tool, it's yeah, a way to share some context for research. Like I'm a big fan of workflows, even as one doesn't want to like hold on to them like, law.
yeah, so they have to be like both, they can be both stabilizing and flexible at the same time, right? So you have something that gives you maybe moments of decision making to talk about, like I did this because of that, or maybe also because only because I like to, whatever. Um, and also be flexible enough to kind of be, change for the specific necessities of like a very specific data set that, you needed to sort of um, rethink the workflows.
Yeah, one of
Yeah.
the questions in the original list was like, when has making a workflow changed your question? And I run into this
Hmm.
a lot, actually, especially working on supporting many different students working across many different
Hmm.
languages. When I'm teaching my non-English text analysis class, I do my best to like have more or less like consistent sets of instructions for the different activities for the students in the different languages. But the class is set up so that like anyone can come to me in any language that they can read. Like I don't need to read it if they can read it.
Wow. Hmm.
But this also means that like until the first day of class, I have no idea what I'm working with. Like I've probably got the usual suspects, but usually there is one person who shows up with a language that I have never worked with before, um, and so we go figure out like can we can we do this standard like principal component analysis like Jupyter notebook like for this language? Like actually, no, it turns out that like there's no NLP model for it at all. Actually, for
Mm.
that matter, it turns out that like there's no OCR that reliably works for it. And so all of a sudden, like big wrench gets thrown into this, and instead of that student working on principal component analysis for like things in this language, they're working on training a new handwritten text recognition model for doing like right to left Ottoman Turkish, which I mean is literally an example that happened one year that I taught this class. And the student actually like got really far in improving the handwritten text recognition capabilities for the documents they were working with. But it was just like all of a sudden like what the quarter looked like for them shifted dramatically just because
Hmm.
the same tools and facilities that I had based the class around expecting for those languages were just not there. And so you do something else.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe we can dwell a little bit on how to sort of organize your work when we switch to one of the other questions that I
Oh yeah,
sent you.
sorry.
No worries. About the Sutro project. Can you tell us a little bit about that one? Because I still remember, feels old saying that, but maybe not everybody knows about it. So maybe you can give us an insight.
Yeah, I mean that is yeah, maybe the most extreme example of workflows, I guess, of the
Hmm.
project I've worked on. So this came about, and this was the sort of project that like I think no one would ever get into if they had any idea what it was going to turn into. So honestly, like naivete was an essential component of taking up this work and just like a desire to help. So immediately following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a lot of us were sort of flailing around trying to think of ways to help. Anna Kias, who was a music librarian at Tufts, posted about a data rescue event for, Ukrainian music collections.
Hmm.
There was a music conference coming up, and so she was going to get a bunch of music librarians to help with this. Um, and that seemed like a great idea. But also, it was a week in the future. We didn't really know how quickly things would go with this war. And so it seemed like we needed to be doing more and faster. And so Sebastian Majstorovic, who was in Vienna, and I and Anna and Andrea Segerberg in Sweden, ended up getting together and just basically trying to web archive as much Ukrainian
Hmm.
cultural heritage very broadly defined as we could find online, kind of in the spirit of other rapid response, socially engaged digital humanities efforts. And we were just floored with the response. I mean, 400 people signed up to help in the first couple days. Ultimately, the number of people involved was over 1,300. We really
Wow.
pushed, the limits of how many people can be editing a Google spreadsheet at the same time before like the thing just melts. Um, so yeah, I mean that workflows were really important with that one, and we were basically, it's a classic like building the airplane as you're flying it kind of situation. We just
Hmm.
jumped in and started doing things. But quickly realized that like if we wanted to scale this beyond like us a handful of like reasonably technically savvy digital humanities people helping to do things, and certainly there were enough things that needed doing, we needed to kind of make some workflows so that we could say to
Hmm.
people, like, here are three concrete ways you can help. You can, make sure the things are captured by the Wayback Machine. You can use Browsertrix Cloud for a higher fidelity capture, and you can, help with these sort of like quality control and metadata things. And like these are the steps for each of those. So I mean, we did do a fair amount of in the very early days. We did a fair number of like live online tutorial sessions helping people install the Docker-based browser tricks software. Like, I mean, these are people in many cases who were like using the command line for the first time. Like
Hmm.
very much, non-super tech savvy folks who in the beginning gravitated towards like the less tech savvy workflows. Um, but in the first, week or so of the project, there was a power outage in the Bay Area, and the Internet Archive went down. And in this moment of like there being a sense of every hour counting, that really solidified our feeling that this needed to be a distributed effort. There needed to be no single point of failure, including our flaky Bay Area power companies here, that would stop the work. And so that was a moment where people made that leap and were willing to like level up technically in a way that they would have been kind of intimidated to do otherwise. So we talked people through installing Docker and running things from the terminal and all of that, which happily quickly became unnecessary because of BrowserTrix Cloud. Like the BrowserTrix folks had just gotten a grant to make this cloud-based platform where it would be, as easy as like clicky to do these captures. And they had just gotten the money and they had like just gotten like the super beta version going, and like we immediately put it into use, at scale. They were real troopers about that.
Cool.
So yeah, I mean, like the workflows, thinking about workflows that you can hand to people to be able to scale up work, and thinking about the levels of technical proficiency, like of the people that you're working with, and like trying to write your workflows, to target people who are like, in those places with their comfort with technology, became really important. And I mean, also people wanted to understand kind of like how the small piece they were doing fit into the bigger picture. So also illustrating for them, like you're doing this thing and this data will go over here and eventually we'll be able to link it with that thing. And like the big goal is like digital repatriation and like giving people their data back, like if things are lost during the war, like being able to tell that whole story while also being very concrete about the smaller pieces that we're asking people to do, were all important parts of that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was really impressed watching that grow. That was really a very, I think a very good moment anyway.
It
Um,
was.
yeah.
It felt good, and it felt like we could do something. And I mean, it turned out that actually what we were doing was something that nobody else was doing.
Hmm.
I mean, it's shocking that like, despite all of the push for like, digital and websites and digitization and all this stuff over the past, like, I mean, at this point, like 30 years, it really does seem that like by and large, no one really thought about the question of um like how do you preserve this stuff? Like what does it look like when this stuff is at risk? And like how do you protect it the way that like, we have all these organizations, Europa Nostra, the Smithsonian, like all involved like with UNESCO, like about physical cultural heritage, but like no one had really thought through the digital piece. So yeah,
Hmm.
that's overdue.
So do you think that your workflows or the way that you kind of designed these things with your project, does that, I mean, it kind of leads us straight into the question of digital archiving anyway, right? So how is that, how far have we come from your project to present day? Is there like a solution? Is there proper archiving? What do you think?
No, no, I
No.
mean
Yeah, I
like
was afraid you would say that, but
no, no, it's still terrible. It's like we had all kinds of ideas for thinking about like what would we do in a more proactive world around digital archiving? Like how can we because I mean honestly, like we could have done a much better job for a lot of these institutions if we had started in January or early February,
hmm.
times when like we basically the writing was on the wall that like things were going to go sideways. And like, how do you work with places that are not actively like under physical attack by missiles, to make sure that their records are being captured? What can we think about in terms of like sister city models, to have sort of
Hmm.
pair institutions to like make sure that like, copies of things are archived proactively. Um, I mean, there's a lot of things that we could be doing better, especially if you had like a active coordinating entity, be it UNESCO, be it
Hmm.
IFLA, like to sort of help smooth over these things. But I mean, unfortunately, like the world has kind of gone from crisis to crisis ever since. And now things are actually far worse in the US, when it comes to the preservation of things online and digital things and things being taken down, than I think Ukraine was in, at that point. So
Okay.
ironic, but here we are. And there
Hmm.
are people, including Sebastian, who has been working with Linda Kellum on the Data Rescue Project, who are proactively trying to ensure at least that like the government stuff that is immediately at risk, is preserved. But at this point, with institutions, deciding to take down, DEI related things before
Yeah.
it's a problem, and generally trying to keep a low profile and removing organizations and like, taking down online collections, pretty much everything everywhere is at risk. And like there's not nearly enough resources to do any of the emergency stuff like to the extent that it needs, let alone any of the proactive things. I mean that the proactive dreams we had for kind of implementing these workflows to ensure just in case preservation, like that's a pipe dream for a better world that we are so far from now.
Hmm. I don't quite say what to say. Don't quite know what to say to that now. I started the day by always saying how optimistic in general I am, but that doesn't sound very optimistic, I'm afraid. But maybe we can find another point where we could sort of just follow up with the discussion coming from what you told us about the different workflows that you're handing out to people to kind of join the project. Some of us here in the room are also engaged in citizen science projects. Would you say that this is something quite similar, actually, that where workflows have this kind of supporting characteristic?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's basically like citizen science on, on speed or whatever. Like, yeah, like, with a lot of the citizen science projects, like everyone understands, like, yeah, you pitch in when you can, and like it's great, and it's like helping humanity sort of like nudge things along. With something like Sucho, like things are immediately at risk, and if you have time right now, like we need you to do this, and this, so please go do it. So yeah, I mean there's a certain amount of like injection of urgency into the whole thing, but I mean the principle is the same whether or not there's that element to things, that like there's just more work that needs to be done than any group of skilled technologists can do. And maybe some of it like could be scaled up computationally, but honestly, like the fastest, easiest, and most reliable way to do it is to like throw some humans at it. And especially when you're sort of well matched between needing some humans to do some things, and humans who are experiencing existential dread and like wanting to do something to help. It actually is a pretty good match, and sort of is a win-win for everybody.
So this is I just kind of picked this up because I think this is like when we spoke about workflows over the past week, I think this is something that we hadn't spoken about so much, like a position where workflow can actually help engage people and sort of make things more accessible. We were focusing more on how do we design workflows? Like, is it, for example, a possibility to design a decision tree as sort of a tool for getting to the workflow, where you kind of define certain questions where you just have to say yes, no, and then kind of make your way through.
Yeah, no, I mean this is the decision tree was kind of part of the workflow that we had for Sucho, where we'd get a bunch of people would recommend sites, we would check to see like is it already on our list, like okay, like if yes, then do that, then like if it's not on our list, is it like a subset of something on our list? So if someone puts in a specific exhibit and we're already getting the whole museum site, then we don't need to have a separate listing for this one exhibit because it should be covered by the museum, and sort of on that way too. Then there's a decision tree of like, okay, so we're going to capture it. What workflows do we need to do that? Is this something where we need to use our the scraper tool that someone has made for DSpace, or the scraper tool that someone has made for a specific kind of library catalog, or boy, were there ever a lot of 3D tours that like had to be captured, and those were all like special things, and like one person like got really good at doing that, and so like, all right, I'll pass it off to them. Is this something that has a lot of like interactive JavaScripty things? And definitely we need browser tricks, because the Heritrix crawler like is not likely to catch all those things. So yeah, I mean, whether or not you're in the position to like be writing the code to like implement any of the modules of the workflow, like having someone who has like kind of a holistic view of like, it's easy to lose track when you're getting like into the weeds of the workflow. It's easy to lose track of like the big picture. Like, what are we trying to do here?
Hmm.
And sometimes you just like get so stuck on like solving this one problem, and it just like eats your whole brain, that like, it can help, although also be sort of upsetting for the people who are like deep in those weeds, but it can help to have
Hmm.
someone come in and be like, actually for the end result, it really doesn't matter if it's like done this way or that way. Like either is fine, just please pick one. And that can I mean, after you've spent a week, like debating the pros and cons of A and B, like that can be kind of upsetting to hear.
Yeah.
But also sometimes it's what you need. Just to sort of be like, all right, right, like we're working for this goal over here, and like the point isn't A and B as much as I have like invested all my emotional energy this week into A and B. So,
Hmm.
so like having someone on the team, like honestly, who doesn't have the technical chops to like get into the details of A and B, can sometimes be like really essential for
Yeah.
making workflows that make sense in the big picture.
Yeah. So, and that was one point that we also discussed with Anna Neubert this earlier today, who's an expert in project management, to like have this particular perspective also, because, if you design workflows only while you're sort of inside the workflow, can
Hmm.
be really stressful.
Hmm.
And that for especially in like interdisciplinary settings, it could be really helpful to have someone to do this sort of meta perspective work on kind of designing the whole thing. And maybe this would be sort of my last question to you, and then we can open to more questions from other people in the room. What is your take on workflows regarding interdisciplinarity, especially because you brought up the point of how much involvement would the tech people have? I started my career in quantitative text analysis in a project that in 2000 early 2000s, '05 or something.
Hmm.
And the structure of that project was there's the humanists, and then there's someone who does exactly what we tell them to do without us knowing what we're supposed to tell them, so that they can do what we want them to do. And I think
Hmm.
this has changed quite a bit in the past 20 years. But yeah, so what is your take on workflows in interdisciplinary setting? Maybe that would be.
Oh, I mean, maybe my job here today is to be sort of like the Debbie Downer to your optimism. But like as much as
No.
this has changed in terms of, kind of well thought through collaborations between like
Hmm.
technologists and humanists, this still happens constantly when you have a scholar who sort of stumbles into a digital project and then hires an undergrad CS major,
Yeah.
to and and again, the undergrad CS major doesn't know anything about the field, doesn't know anything about like the long history of interdisciplinary conversation, doesn't know what questions to ask. And so they end up making like a bunch of arbitrary choices, or they do exactly what the humanist asked, which means that like the end result is not at all what they want because they were asking using, maybe borrowed jargon they didn't quite understand. I mean, my favorite,
Hmm.
my favorite slash least favorite word is database. Whenever someone comes to me asking for a database, the immediate follow-up is not like, yes, boss, I'm gonna go make you a database. Like, it's tell me more. Because a database can mean like a table in a Word document. A database can
Exactly.
mean like, a WordPress site. It almost certainly never means a MySQL database, but if you like, if a faculty member says, I want a database to a CS undergrad, they're gonna get a SQL database and then they will have no idea what to do with it. So yeah, this happens all the time. And I think this is why there's kind of an ongoing need, for people to act as like interpreters in
Hmm.
these conversations. I mean, that is I mean, I think probably like the greatest utility that I've managed to kind of offer like within like large complex digital humanities projects, where like the technologists are maybe like super excited about like, a certain, I mean, like AI right now, like is the thing, right? Like,
Hmm.
like there are some people who are just like ready to like throw a large language model at like anything that comes their way. And there's, you know, the scholars who like want this like specific thing that honestly like may not be like at all an AI thing in the least. And so if they just say what they want to the developer, they'll get something that isn't at all what they need. So having people who have like been through this a few times, you know, whether it's in an ongoing role on the project or even just like, you know, going to get like coffee or a beer with the team, to like ask those questions that no one's thinking about asking, or kind of helping the scholar realize like, oh, I need to be way more specific when I'm talking to the technologist. Like I like no, like they can't just like, you know, throw my text into like AI to summarize it and then do things with it after that. Like that completely ruins like the point of what I'm trying to do. You know, I think that's just super, super important. And yeah, I mean, it like the interdisciplinarity thing, you know, just comes back time and again. You know, we saw it. Maybe like our third book of the Data Setters Club, is about me getting super excited about identifying changes in, you know, different releases of the Babysitters Club and like where did they edit things, where did they change things? 'Cause these books are like, you know, now 30, 40 years old. You know, like what changes were made. I was like really fixated on identifying those and like using different tools to find them. And then, you know, Maria Ciceri, who's a childhood studies scholar, is like it's fine that you're doing this, I guess, but like this is not an interesting question in my field. Like we all know that people do this and like the details aren't really that interesting or important. And so, you know, I mean, like these, like it can be hard as like a less technical humanities person to kind of like assert yourself when it feels like the train is going and like all the energy is going into this thing that like isn't really the point. And you know, similarly on the other side, you know, sometimes, you know, especially if the scholar like is being very specific about like how they want things implemented, you know, sometimes it can take some courage to speak up and be like, you know, if you're willing to like compromise on this thing, we can actually do this in like, you know, less than half the time if we can do this some slightly different way and kind of like bring that expertise to bear. So I mean, ultimately it's a human problem and it's a communication problem and you know kind of a team building problem and relationships, you know, more than anything that is really fundamentally technical or workflow. It's you know, people talking to people across a wide range of like different experiences and priorities and like trying to build a culture where, you know, everyone can feel kind of listened to and respected.
This is so interesting because in each and every one of the conversations of today, this was in the end the most important point. Team spirit. I think Anna coined the thing that I'm going to put on my wall is workflows fail when communication fails.
Yep.
So everybody was very much into, you know, there's lots of different perspectives, but I think all three of you finally, you know, the final point or one of the most important points was talk to each other, take each other seriously with, you know, all the things that humans are, and all the different competencies and all that kind of thing. So this is really, that's like my main takeaway of today is we can talk about workflows and the digital as much as we want, but as long as we talk to each other, we're going to be fine. Once we stop trying to sort of make sense of each other, and sort of rely on workflows or technologies too much, that's when, you know, there's little success to be expected. I really like that a lot. Thank you for that. Which brings us to an end of this conversation. Quinn, thank you so much.